Okay, here we're going to address the importing of assets, which is a fairly simple routine. I've created two folders here so you can consolidate all of your imported assets into audio clips and mocap clips. If you want to import assets, there's basically two ways to do it. One is you open one of your directories and you select a file and just drag and drop it into it. The second is to right click and import new asset. And then once you do that, you get the Explorer window, seek out your asset, and import it. In this case, I've already got a few audio clips and a few timeline mocap clips to go with it. So when you import one of the mocap clips, you'll see it, and here's the model. Okay, generally they come in at 0.01 scale factor, 1/100th of the size that the FBX file generally has it as. Most everything here you can leave as standard check marked. Then in the rig, you have to make sure, because we're using the retargeting system where we can retarget from one animation onto an avatar that's configured the same way. So we've got this create from model. If you click the configure, you'll see it. And what it'll do is it'll tell you which one of the bones is associated with each one of the situations here. Same for the head. Same for the left hand. Same for the right hand. Some of the bones here aren't mapped, but it's not of any consequence because the robots really don't have any hands. So when that's all done, you say done, it'll return you back to the scene. Now this is the part you're going to want to understand. In this, we had the whole motion capture selected. Well, the whole motion capture, we've selected a portion of it, which you can see by the in and out markers here, and then the light blue section. So that gives us a loopable dance routine. Now you may want to do this with some of your mocap, you may not. It's up to you. The second thing that you got to be aware of so that it's handled is if you got a loop time, select the loop time, and as you pull it back and forth, you'll notice that it'll go out and it'll turn green. When it turns green, it's generally a loop match. Body transform rotation, you're going to want to bake it into pose and based it upon body orientation. Root transform, bake it into pose. Feet, that'll keep the feet basically looking like they're supposed to, attached to the ground, even though there's not necessarily a ground here. It's basically a virtual ground in space. And bake into pose, the center of mass. And if you've done all that, then you hit apply and it'll set it up for you. And that's basically the import of animation clips. You can create several different animation clips from a single mocap just by selecting sections of it if you wish to break it up. Or your scene could comprise one single long mocap that's got all the dialogue and the dance routines, etc. already involved. Now, when you import the audio files, you can check them out one by one. You can either load them in the background. Ambisonic, you may want to or not want to check this. That's a kind of a plugin that gives sounds a location in space, including above and below, as well as left and right, and back and front. So We have the compression format. You can choose PCM. Vorbis is open source. It does an excellent job. Same thing. Make sure there's stereo. Yada yada. Same thing with the rest of it. When you're done, like you'll notice if you change any of this, compressed in memory, it'll ask you to apply. We'll just revert it, decompress, unload. And that's basically the import of files, audio, and mocap. We'll set them up so that they're ready to be used on the timeline. In this section, we're going to show how easy it is to add clips, audio clips, to flesh out one of the scenes that's going to be involved in the sequence. So you open the virtual rigs, and that's each one of your rig controlled objects. You go to the master IK rig. This one in particular already has an animation track that's associated with the object itself, as you can see in the field here. So then you would basically right click, add animation clip. I have 3 clips that I set up for the tutorial, so you can find them by starting at the top. You can see the tutorial demo clip. So we'll add that one there. Then we'll go down here and we'll choose Master 2. And as you'll see, it doesn't have an animation track already. You can see over in the playable directors, what we'll do momentarily is we can put the inspector into debug mode and find all the scene bindings that it has. And you'll see that there is no scene bindings currently. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an animation track, and we'll go back and check the debug mode, and from there we're going to make sure that the field's connected up here, and you'll see that the scene binding shows an animation track and its value is on the master rig 01. So we would do the same thing here. Alternatively, you could add from animation clip this way, or you can go down into the timeline mocap clips, and let's choose tutorial demo clip 02. Add from animation clip. Tutorial. Okay, it should be in the list, and if you run across something like that, you'll see that we got dance shuffle and tutorial demo clip 01 and gesture 6 and gesture 7. Now say we wanted to rename those, so we'll go into demo clip 02. We'll go out of debug mode because we don't need to look at all that information. And let's create a third one that's the entire track. We'll call that tutorial demo clip 002. We don't need a loop time here. Center of mass. And take a quick look at it. Seems fine. Hit apply. Then we'll go back up under here. And we can add it direct from the folder like you see there. Okay. So now we want to add, we could continue this with, you know, master rig 3, master rig 4, etc. If they don't have an animation track, you right click, add animation track, and then you would right click on the animation track or drag your animation clip directly from the folder onto the track. Once you have all those in place, you've got the timing set up for them. You could go up here to the musical score, and in this particular case we're using Flight of the Bumblebee, and you can set its duration, its starting point, etc., etc. In this particular case, we've set it to 20 seconds. So you would do that simply by, if this isn't in place, you can right click and add an audio track, such as this audio track, and then you would add the audio source. So you'd basically just drag the same object in to create it, etc., etc., and then you could add your, you know, add an audio clip from there. But we'll remove that, seeing as we already got a clip in there. And as well, if you have vocal tracks, you can go in here to the Puppeteer lip sync audio source, and you'll see I've already added a track there. The track could be moved back and forth so that you can set the timing that you want. Again, if this field is empty, just drop the object right in it. And remember, this is component based, so the objects themselves will be acting as tracks. Once you've got all that set up, you can just hit play.
Whoa, almost got me.
And as you see, it'll
I dare
play
you.
both the animations that we installed on Rig 1 and Rig 2. So I'm going to explain the use of the bi-zeme controller. A bi-zeme is the visual representation of a phoneme. A phoneme, again, is a sound like a consonant or a syllable or a vowel. And so the way I've approached this is I get the audio clip that's being played on the track. I query a set of samples starting at an offset based on the time. So in this case, I'm getting 512. I go through it, I read all their loudness gradients, and then I divide by 512 to get an average loudness gradient. Then I begin adding it frame by frame as a member of this list. And then as the list is fully populated, I remove the first one and add on to the end, which shuffles all of them backwards. Then I begin filling each one of these slots with the average of each one of these loudness gradients, which is over a period of 8 sample times. At this point, we're sampling at 15 times a second. As you can see here, sample data times per second. So it'll create a gradient slope that's based on the last previous 8 frames, and of course that'll multiply itself over a course of many frames. So you'll be getting a lot of samples here, and you'll be able to find a slope. The slope will determine the angle of the servo that drives the jaw. And so I have a minimum angle of 0, max angle of 50. They may be changed depending on the configuration of the servo, how far you want the jaw to open, its initial offset, etc., etc. So let's play this, and you'll watch up at the top that the scenes will change, the sequence will change, and that I've used this basically two cubes here on the side so you can get a better view of how a Viseme controller works. So again, to install a track on that, you'd open up one of the Puppeteer rigs, select its lip sync audio source, make sure that it's got a track going on, do the right click, add from audio clip, and then from there, we'll watch it work its magic here.
Kaixo, Julen Ribas naz, marrazkilarixa, mondrautarra, eta oso zoriontsuenaz nire arkatza eta pintzelekin.
Whoa, almost got me. Try a little harder. I dare you.
So as you can see, the jaw was opening and closing. It had something to do with the loudness of it and how long it was being held. It would close when silenced, and when the clip stopped,
Julen Ribas naz, marrazkilarixa,
it would show. And it seems to update these things. You have to go off them and then back on them, and you'll notice that the clip has changed up there. So that's basically the use of it. You'll also notice that I've got max loudness gradient that it reads on a continuous basis and sets the max loudness that it finds along the clip. Also, you have a threshold here, and you can compare this threshold with the value down here. You're kind of getting a standard value of a current loudness. And if you're finding that your sample is keeping the jaw open all the time, you'd up the threshold. If you find that your audio track is too silent, you're going to have to turn the threshold down. And so basically you're going to have to look at your clips, etc. I'd suggest to normalize them in an audio editor, which you're probably going to want anyways to have consistency for the stage show. So that's the use of the Viseme controller. There's one again sitting on each one of the Puppeteer rigs. Yada yada. This one's not installed, so you do the same thing, and you can either check analyze audio at the very beginning. Make sure that you have the controlled servo in there. When we add a jaw, make sure that the jaw is connected in there. If not, just drag and drop the jaw servo in there, and it should do everything else basically for you. So that's how to use the Viseme controller. In this section, we're going to show how to set up a stage lighting system. Right now, we're going to do it on a single track here. Go to the stage lighting. You'll notice that there's a couple components under here. One is the spotlight dynamics. It's basically for the movement of the spotlights. And so we have the default look at where it's looking at these targets right here in front of each one of the bots. And we have also as well use random marquee sweeps. So if you click that on, then you switch that off. We have a signal for dropping that on the timeline to automatically do it. The random marquee sweeps are basically what they sound like. An arc is chosen for the spotlight, and it sweeps from here to there, and then it begins choose a new random position to sweep to, and it does that. So, and we have marquee sweep cycle duration and the cycle timer. So then we go down into the lighting scheme controller, which controls basically the overall look of the colors and intensities, and we have things involved with it, like we can sync it to the audio source, so it'll kind of pulse up and down with the main soundtrack. We can change the update step timer on that. We can cycle through the colors. We can change the cycle duration. Currently it's at 4 seconds. You may want that longer, you may want that shorter. Then we have a color choice mode. We can either choose random colors or use palette colors. Then we have a light effects mode. We can have sequential flashing where they flash from left to right in a sequence. We can do it with color flashing. Same thing. Instead of this would be white flashing, and this would be sequential color flashing. And then we have random flashing, which just chooses whether a light is randomly going to be on or off during one of the cycles. And same thing with random color flashing, it'll pick a different color. Down here we have the audio sync data. And sample length, current loudness, previous loudness. Then we have the gradient sums control the light's intensity. And we got a sample vector off it, and that'll control X, Y, Z of that sample vector controls the light's RGB. It's basically procedural to stop you from having to keyframe a bunch of positions to follow the box and a bunch of colors. So as far as colors, I've created a series of palettes, some of them with just straight up names. You want to go to deep sea palette, a sky palette, a forest palette, blazing fall, spectral, deep space. Then if you'll note, I've got custom palette 1, custom palette 2, etc., etc. So we have 10 custom palettes. They're all set to white. That's so that you can set up any set of palette colors that you feel that you might need, and use a signal to drive the lights into that palette color range. So then next we have the EL wires, which is, it stores where each one of the rig wire positions is. And we have a cycle timer on that. The cycle duration is 0.1 currently. We can have a random ripple, synchronized ripple, a sequential ripple, use all wires on, and we could also use the audio control on the mouth EL wires. And there's a selection of each one of the Visine controllers. If you want to get to them quickly, it'll automatically unfold the hierarchy for you. You can change the emissive colors. Generally they're just to be on or off, as these only have basically two values as far as the byte value being sent out to the DMX lighting rig, and that's 0 and 255 for off and on. Then we have the selection of signal receivers, which will be dropped along a signal track, which I'll show you how to do shortly. And so it's basically calling each one of these and calling, whether it's an EFX random ripple, whether you're going to use a sequential, synchronized. Then we have the lighting scheme setups for each one. Unfortunately, you have to keep the inspector wide. So if you want to see what they really are, if you look here, you'll only see lighting scheme. So if you want to see what they really are, you can do it one of two ways. You can either pull the inspector all the way out, or just open it and look and see that it's, for example, this one's connected to lighting scheme to custom palette 2. So if you want to create a lighting scheme, right now we'll see it just stays if you play it, it'll just stay on the white colors. So we'll stop that. And on the stage lighting, we'll create a signal track by right-clicking in the track area, choose signal track, and a signal track will show up. So say we want to start out with marquee sweeps. So we'll add a signal emitter, go down to here, we're in the lighting scheme, and we'll say lighting scheme, use marquee sweeps. Okay, fine. Let's go to the marquee sweeps.
Kaixo, Julen Ribas naz, marrazki larixa.
And we'll add another signal emitter down here, because it appears you need more than one. So we'll emit a signal, lighting scheme, We'll switch it back to lighting scheme, use. Blazing ball palette.
Kaixo, Julen Ribas naz, marrazkilarixa,
Oh, we have to put the signal receiver in. No, we didn't put the signal receiver in, so there's a little clue. The signal receiver, just drop the stage lighting thing in there. Same with any time you set up a track, it's not necessarily going to be hooked up and doesn't do it automatically for you. So now that we got the signal receiver in there,
Kaixo, Julen
you'll
Ribas
see
naz,
it's doing the thing.
marrazkilarixa,
Now it's cycled to the
Mondrautarra,
green palette.
eta oso zoriontsuenaz nire arkatza eta pintzelek.
Excuse me, to blazing ball palette. Then we'll go down here and we'll drop another one along the timeline. Add signal emitter. And then we'll choose a signal emitter. And we'll say lighting scheme sequential color flashing. We'll add one more to change it back to one of the palettes. So add signal emitter. And then you go to the emit signal. And lighting scheme to spectral palette. So let's run that and see what happens.
Kaixo, Julen
There's
Ribas
the
naz,
sweep.
Marrazkilarixa,
There's the blend of
Mondrautarra,
ball palette.
eta oso
Now we got
zoriontsuenaz
random
nire arkatza eta
flashing.
pintzelek.
And we've got cycle to the. So that's basically how you would be setting up a signal receiver, signal emitter, etc., for a particular scene. We're going to go over again how to create a set of timeline assets for the scene so that you can sequence them. So we'll go up to the track editor window, and the scene timeline assets window will open first, and we'll move this over. Notice we've got test scene 1, test scene 2 timeline assets that were already created beyond the default. So let's create test scene 3. And then we'll go create new timeline asset set. And so what it's doing now is it's cycling through and is creating each one of the assets in a folder to install it in. Notice now we got scene 3 timeline assets, and go down here where we can watch a playable director. Right now we're going to load these new scene timeline to playable director, which is one way that you might do this. As you add a new scene, you go in, create a new scene, set of scene assets, and then you load that to the timeline, and all the playable directors up here will now have timeline assets associated with that scene. So you get all timeline asset sets. It will show all of them. You can select any one of these, such as the default, and load selected scene to timeline. You'll see it's got no prefix underscore, so that's what's been loaded. Again, that's the select scene timeline assets. Let's change it to 2. Load selected scene. We got scene 2, and again, that's through all these playable directors. So we'll change it back to the default set. Bam. So that you can create as many set of new scene timeline assets. You could do it one at a time, or if you have your entire show planned out, you could do it one at a time. Use that pane that we just used, the window, and you can use that to load the timeline assets in from the editor. And then we go to the scene jukebox. And so the first thing we do, we notice that these are empty up above. There's our template object over here. And so we're going to get the timeline directories. Here they are. Now we're going to create a scene sequence. So we'll select one of these. We'll do it in an order of 1, 2, 3. So I have selected scene to sequence. You'll note it there, scene sequence. Let's do it out of order. Let's get scene 3. Add selected scene to sequence. And then we'll add scene 2. Selected scene to sequence. And then once you've done that, we're going to go over here and we're going to load the selected scene sequence to the jukebox controller. Now, I'm going to clear this out over here because we have some leftovers that weren't tracked from a previous tutorial. So I'm going to delete those. This object here, leave that because that's the template object. So we'll get scene timeline directories. We're going to clear this out. And then we'll do this again. And you'll see that we have 1, 2, 1, 3, and 2. And then you'll see that what these objects are actually doing over here is they're holding a reference. So as I go through the sequence, I get this one, then I get the next one, and it has all the references that I need to load and store. Same with the test 2 timeline asset. So that's how you would do it. And then this is the trick right here. So we have a signal receiver. We only got one signal here, and it's load the next scene sequence of assets. So up here, we've got all the information that we need. We can get the current scene timeline asset set. See that it's test 1. We could also select a scene if we want to load a scene. Get a scene and load it. We could change the index. We'll change it to 1. And you can watch down here. And we note that index 1 is test scene 3. So we do that, and we note it. That is test scene 3. And again, up here, you'll have to do the right click, decide what type of track you want, animation, a signal, or an audio track, and then set your scene up like that, and it'll play the scenes in sequence. So set that back to 0 when you're ready to go. Hit play, and it plays. So what I'm going to show you here is that let's get something that's got a timeline on it already. So we'll go to scene 1. And we've got a single signal on there. So what that signal does, if you look over here, it's scene jukebox sequencer. It loads the next scene timeline asset set. So as you set up your scene, you're probably going to know the length of the scene in time, in seconds. So I've got it set low here because there's no need to run through like 2 minutes of timeline just to show you that. But what happens is you'll look and you'll see that your longest audio track or your longest animation track might be 2 minutes, 49 seconds, and 4 frames. So, or it might be 49.2 seconds. So you would drag this down to 49.2 seconds, which would be the end of the longest clip in that scene. And when it gets to that scene, it's going to automatically, the signal is going to hit the signal receiver on here, and the signal receiver is going to trigger the function in the scene jukebox sequencer to load the next scene sequence in, it's going to change the index, which you can watch it happen up over here. And it's going to load that sequence in, and when it's finished, it's going to stop. And you can track what the current scene index is up here so that you know that things are working correctly for you, your current sequence scene, and the next one that it's going to show. So that can get you all set up, understanding the show while it's in progress, so that you can keep track of everything. And that's basically how scene sequencing works. Here we're going to show you, we're going to actually reiterate here how you would take a set of scenes and sequence them together to make a show. So again, you want to create your scenes, you go to the scene timeline assets window. This will create the scene for you. Make sure that you populate things, get all your timeline set so we have proper references to everything in there. When you're finished with that pane and you've made all the timeline assets that you're going to work with at that point, then you go to the scene jukebox editor, and that you get all the scenes, set up your scene sequence, selected scene, etc., like that. And then you can add selected scene to the sequence. And then when you've added all your scenes in the sequence, bam, test 1, test 2, test 3. And say you wanted a pause scene. Okay, so we'll go back and say we want a standard pause scene, whatever. So we would go and open the scene timeline assets window, and we'll just call it standard pause. And then we would go create new timeline scene asset set. So while we wait for it to chug along, what we're going to have now is a way to insert another scene into the sequence. That is a pause. It's one of those things where, okay, we got a scene, we got another scene, we got another scene, but we have a standard routine in there, like an entrance or an exit from the stage, and you're going to use that several times. So there's no need to like keyframe it or whatever each separate time. Just set it up once. We've got the standard pause timeline assets here. So we can get rid of this window now that we've created them. We're not necessarily going to load them now because we're going to work with them in this. So let's get all the scene timeline directories. Okay, now note that it's added the standard pause. So anytime you add a new directory, make sure when you open this window that you get all the scene timeline directories. So then we got all the scenes available here. We see that the standard pause showed up. These generally sort themselves in alphabetical order. And so we're going to add a selected scene, standard pause. So we add the selected scene. But say now we want to pause between scene 1 and 2. And we also want to pause between scene 2 and 3. So we'll add standard pause again, add selected scene to sequence, put the standard pause in. So now we have a scene plays, then we got a standard pause, then we go into scene 2, we got a standard pause, go into scene 3, we got a standard pause. So now that we've done that, let's load the selected scene sequence to the scene jukebox sequencer so that we can work with it at runtime. Again, oftentimes it's a good idea to get rid of all these here so you don't have extra sets. Those are artifacts from a previous. So load selected scene to scene jukebox sequencer. You'll see we got test scene 1, standard pause, test scene 2, standard pause, test scene 3. By the way, if you have extra objects in there, it's not going to matter, but it's just confusing because the only objects that are going to be dealt with was the objects that were sent to the scene sequencer controller when you press this button. So you'll see we got the scene sequence assets objects. So they go and this is the objects itself, a reference to them, and this is the particular component that's installed on those objects that holds the lists of the scene timeline. And it had to be done this way because we can't use nested lists because Unity's not able to serialize them properly. In other words, it can't make an internal list of a list of lists. So we have to make a separate object with each list on it, and this is actually a pretty effective way to handle it. And you have a visual cue over in the hierarchy so that you can see what they're there. You can look at each one of them, go through, see what they all are, etc., etc. So now that you've done that and got them all set up, we'll go back to this component here, and we'll recall that we have this single signal that this scene timeline jukebox components controller, and that's basically what it actually is. It controls the components for a scene, and it's a jukebox. So you make sure you got a signal, you load the particular tracks that you want in there, and you do this by get the selected scene sequence. So now we've got test scene 1. We would do the right click, add signal emitter, go to the signal emitter, choose the load next timeline, asset scene set, and you'll see that it shows what signal is stored on there. In other words, what method or function it's going to call and on what object. And so it basically calls it on this and tells it that scene is now over. It's now time. Based on this current index, we're going to advance the current index by 1, and we're going to load the next set of timeline assets into the playable directors, and then we're going to begin playing those. So a show is a series of scenes. The scenes tracks are stored in the scene sequence assets. I probably did overkill and made sure that anything that could possibly be animated had a playable director on. But as far as it goes, setting up a scene, all that you're going to have to be aware of is the master IK rigs animations, your stage lighting, your musical score audio source, which is going to be stereo. And so you have a scene Foley effects audio source, which can actually be moved around if you wished. And that could have things like explosion effects that are located within the stereo field by the position of the audio source. That may or may not be useful to you depending on how your show is, but I thought since it didn't take me long to put that in there, I'd put it in there. And then you have to be aware of the puppeteer lip sync audio source. And if you got particular sound effects that you want to have trigger off at a specific time, there's also this here, which you could trigger off sound effects from doing that. Then the only other thing you really have to worry about here is the scene timeline jukebox components controller, and that's where you're actually going to control the starting and the stopping of scenes, and by using this simple single signal at the end of the time that you want. And again, you can whip that back and forth and it'll do it. No keyframing needed. You're not going to have to adjust curves or anything like that. So that's the situation as far as setting up a show. And it will read the number of scenes in the sequence, and you'll get a readout up here of the current scene index, the current sequence scene that it's playing, the next sequence scene in the sequence, and it'll also inform you that the next sequence scene may be that the show is over, and it'll show as the current sequence scene show is over, and it'll show that there's no other scenes left to sequence. So I think you have enough visual clues in there to keep so that you can keep track of what's going on. And there's basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 main objects with the stage lighting, and then you have your sound things, your sound sources. So there's another 5 or 6 things, and then we got the rig control objects 5. So we got the saucer rig, and that's got sets of things to control it. The color blinking on the LED REG strips. You got pallet cycling, cycle blinking, glow pulsing, and then you've got saucer descend and saucer ascend. So the saucer, if you use that signal and installed it on one of its signal receiver timelines, then the saucer would descend for that particular descend for that particular scene. And then you want it to go up, say like 20 seconds, while you would right click, drop another signal emitter on the timeline, on the signal track, and that would be the signal. You would point it at the signal ascend off stage, and at 20 seconds, the saucer would ascend off stage. So, and within this saucer rig, it had to be set up slightly different because of the fact that the actual puppeteer and master IK rig sit inside the saucer object itself, as you can see here. So we got a pulley and capstan situation there, and got the LED strips and stuff. So that's the one difference in the whole thing. I think once you go through it, there's its master IK rig, looks the exact same with the signal receivers. The one difference is you're probably not going to want to use things like crouching or whatever like that, and that's if you're going to use any of the signals. Most of these as are going to be used as animation tracks with mocap clips coming in and installed on the timeline. Same thing, you have the saucer puppeteer rig, and as a child, it's got its lip sync audio source and its Foley or sound effects, if you will. So that's how you would stitch together a bunch of scenes to make a show. Okay, in this we're going to show how the joystick can be used to control the puppeteer's head and neck servos. The jaw, it can be done for that as well, but we're already controlling that through the audio track and the Visine controller. So basically you'll see this is the main switch, whether the joystick can control the head or not. So let's just do a quick test, make sure that that's correct. Look up, look down, look to the left, look to the right. That basically works. You can hand control back off to the look at object, take it back over. Make sure you click back in the scene if you're not getting any reaction for the input system to be working still. In the meantime, course, I've got a set. You can do that manually, and for each puppeteer that you do that to, they're all going to take the same input. So if you want them all like looking left and then looking right and looking up and looking down, then you may manually set each one of these. There's also a signal that will turn this control off or on. So say you have a situation where you have a skit going up to a certain point, but then you are going to come over to microphone or whatever, or have him look at a specific audience member when he's doing that part of his shtick, and you know where that audience member is sitting or whatever, you might want to control that with the joystick, or whenever any other scenarios where you may want to override the head rotation manually from the mocap animation that's playing. So to begin with, you right click and you would put a signal track on, drop the signal receiver in that's sitting on the object itself. Like with all other tracks, you basically drop the object in after you create the track, and that will create the link between the track and the object. So say down here at 3 seconds, we're going to add a signal emitter that says, at this point, we're going to start using the joystick head control. And then we're going to stop looking at that audience member like a few seconds later, 5 seconds later. So we got a signal emitter there, and we're going to point that at stop using joystick head control. So then when the timeline's running, and again, I've got it hooked up to the right joystick on an Xbox gamepad. And so we got control of it right now, and then it passes by, and we've got the control back off. Now, we saw it going at the beginning there, right? It should not have been doing that. So what we do is we go back down to the puppeteer 1, and we uncheck that, and then that way we'll be using signals. So the very first time it comes across a signal to use a joystick, it'll begin. I'll be wiggling it the whole time. Now I have control, up, down. Now the control reverted back to the look at target function. So that's basically how that works. You can add control by a joystick manually and not use a signal track, or you can use the signal track and drop the specific points that you want to take over the animation of the head and the neck from the mocap animation that you have on the Master IK rig track that's driving the scene.